Late last night.
Late last night. Yeah, you're traveling a lot. You're traveling a lot, I guess now, right? Or
Back and forth between New York and Washington, pretty much.
Mostly, yeah. Because a lot of what you're doing is involved that Answer Coalition.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's sort of one of the centers of the coalition.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, there's a lot to talk about because there are a couple of problems remaining in the world. And welcome very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program friend of Conversations, Brian Becker. Brian Becker is involved with, I'm not sure you got a number of people there, but the International Action Center coalescing in a certain sense around, I would think, the philosophical inspiration of Ramsey Clark, who's there, and down on 14th Street. And he's also, I'm not sure the title again, but it's involved with the Answer Coalition. And Brian, it's so good to see you, and welcome very much to him in Conversations.
Thanks, Harold. Nice to be here.
Always good to see you. And maybe you could, we're going to talk about a number of things here on January 21 of 2004. We just heard the President's State of the Union address. They had the Iowa caucus just happened, and that sort of, a lot to talk about. But I wonder, maybe you could, Brian, ground a little bit yourself personally. What's your own background? You're from New York originally and that sort of thing, and maybe weave that in with introducing the audience to the International Action Center and the good folks down there. And then we could talk about current events.
Sure. I think the story of the International Action Center may be more interesting than my personal story, but I grew up in Western New York, in Rochester, New York.
Okay.
My family was involved in the civil rights struggles during the 1960s, and I became a political activist organizer when I was 15, 16 years old, and have been pretty much doing that since then.
Okay.
Fighting for social justice, fighting against war, fighting for a profound reorganization of society, so that people's needs are met first and foremost, rather than having society function as a prop really for corporate America, and especially for the military-industrial complex.
You felt like that right from the time you were a youth?
Well, for people my age, and I'm about 50 years old.
You're 50, okay. Yeah.
Who were active and alive in 1969, 1970, you couldn't not think about the issues of war and peace,
Right.
the issue of militarism, the issue of racism. Those were the issues of the day.
Yeah,
And
the Vietnam thing was raging, yeah.
Exactly.
There were other things going on, if I may, I don't want to, there were other things going on in terms of the broader evolution of events other than the Vietnam War and so forth, but you know, that was a singularly significant moment. There was something, as Bobby Dylan said, blowing in the wind at that time, I would submit.
Yeah, well, the 1960s was a time of great idealism. I mean, the 1960s have been mischaracterized as just a period of extreme radicalism. That started to happen to some extent towards the end of the decade. But I think what was dominant as a characteristic feature of the 1960s was a certain hopefulness that people could, through their own actions and through collective action, make a difference, change the world. And so I think the inspiration for the 60s really was the civil rights movement, the raging civil rights movement against apartheid in the South, against the police state that existed for African American people in the South. And that movement sort of flowed into the struggle for peace, or the struggle against the war in Vietnam. And then, of course, there was the synergy presented by Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party and Dr. King, who said the bombs falling in Southeast Asia are bursting in the inner cities of the United States, that it was impossible for the government of the United States to say that they were going to carry out a war against poverty at home, when in fact they were carrying out a war against poor people in Vietnam. And so the connections between the fight for justice, the fight against racism, the fight for workers' rights at home, and the fight against war were organically linked for a whole generation, and I was a byproduct of that.
Yeah, yeah, they were all linked, and there were you know, you had Muhammad Ali, and that sort of thing. And there were other movements going on culturally and so forth. A lot of the people who are in charge of things politically in this country now tend to look at the 60s in different terms than you, because they may be more comfortable with the historically inherited patterns, and they look at it back as a licentious time of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and people were just having a party, and they were irresponsible people, and they have a strong, deep antipathy to everything that the 1960s stand for, or it seems to me, I've seen that in their demeanor and so forth. There's a real strong dialectic directed at that in negative terms from the right wing, as it were.
For the right wing, and a big part of the corporate establishment considers the 1960s to be an aberration. They can characterize it as a licentious time, or sex and rock and roll and decadent behavior. But what they really objected to about the 1960s was a people's movement, a grassroots movement, a movement from below. Instead of having the people remain silent in the passive objects of history. They became the subject of history. They took control. They fought for civil rights. They fought for women's rights. They fought for gay and lesbian and bi and trans rights. They fought against the war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And what happened in the 60s was a profound awakening. And this awakening led to an expansion of democracy in the United States, and the expansion of democracy was considered a terrible thing by corporate America and by the old powers that be. And I think what we're witnessing with the Bush administration and the drive towards the right, but it also really began during the Clinton administration and even earlier, is an attempt to overturn the verdict of the 1960s, to get rid of affirmative action, to get rid of women's rights, to completely remilitarize the economy. So we're in an epic battle right now to hold on and to expand the things that were achieved in the 60s as a consequence of people's struggles. But I think the powers that be, the establishment, really feels like that was a bad time. It was a time that must be reversed, and we must go back to where people just feel completely unempowered.
Yeah, that's the thing. And they might even be going back on a larger loop in terms of history. There are lots of people who would just like to invalidate everything that happened, even with the New Deal and so forth. Some of the things that Franklin Roosevelt, Social Security, Medicare, they're going to attack that. So there's a real broad-based assault upon that progressive pattern that's been part of this last century.
Well,
seems that way.
Any fettering of capitalism, any regulation on capitalism, any obstacle on the maximizing of profit that would help expand workers' rights or people's rights or civil rights or environmental protections, those are considered roadblocks and obstacles to be overcome by the globalizers, the capitalist globalizers. And so what they're really doing now is shredding everything if they can, if we let them get away with it.
Right.
Everything from the 1930s and all of those things, Social Security, public education,
Medicare,
unemployment insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, women's rights.
Class action suits in the courts, they would, in the name of tort reform.
Those were
all those things.
Those were not gifts given to the people by Franklin Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson or Kennedy. Those were the byproducts of very hard struggle. Our forefathers and foremothers paid with blood, sweat, and tears in order to achieve those things, and that's what we have to fight to hold on to.
Yeah, that's right. Hold on to, because they really are under assault in the name of a, like we were just talking, I mean, in the name of a market fundamentalist. We talk about fundamentalist philosophies, Islamicists or something like that. But we have a grand of people who are market fundamentalists who really think that the government is something that just really does get in the way. Don't you think, in their heart of hearts? Many people that are driven, let's say, just by the neocon coalition or something, or what do you think?
Well, the neocon coalition, represents an ideology that serves a class interest. I mean, as most ideologies do. I mean, they present themselves as abstract ideas and what's good for humanity. But those ideas are good for the corporations. They're good for those who are only worried about the investor class, only worried about the employers, only worried about those who are seeking profit, not worried about the people who actually go to work every day, who want to raise their families, who want to make sure their kids can go to college or make sure that their kids have union jobs at union wages. So this ideology, extremist right-wing ideology, is actually the core ideology, I believe, of the capitalist class when it doesn't feel the power of the people organized in defense of people's rights. So in other words, I don't believe neoconservatism is some just loose canon or an abstract ideological formation in one section of the capitalist establishment. I really think it represents the mainstream thinking of the capitalists if they can get away with it.
You think so, right?
If they think the neoconservative ideology will lead to resistance and rebellion, which we very much hope it does, then it may become restrained by the establishment. But if they can get away with stripping us of our rights and stripping workers of the union rights and getting rid of environmental protections, that would be just fine for corporate America.
So at the core of this capitalist ideology is what you're spelling out is sort of like what would be seen by some as almost like a fascist kind of reading, social Darwinistic reading of the evolution of human affairs, or what moderates it. And Mr. Bush talked to us last night, President Bush, and he talked about compassionate conservatism, and he's going to, So is that what you feel? That it's that capitalism is structurally has problems, and we were just talking off camera before we came in that maybe Karl Marx, who was a critique of the capitalist system, said there are inherent contradictions to the capitalist system. Some of the people who speak up for that capitalist system say, as Francis Fukuyama says, is that the ideological battle is over with the implosion of the Soviet Union. We've come to the end of history, and this is the pattern for the ages that we have in place now. I presume it would be like the Bush administration or something is ready for the ages. But could you address yourself maybe to the dialectic or the
Sure.
ideological underpinnings of political economic thinking?
So the end of history theory would assert that the election of George Bush and this kind of politics is really the crowning achievement of the human species. I mean, that's something people would have to take issue with, anybody who's a rational person.
Take issue with that, yeah.
Perhaps, but
Yeah.
I think what we saw is when the Soviet Union fell, the Soviet government, and the first countries that attempted to go on the socialist road, the apologists for capitalism said, well, that's it. Socialism is dead.
Yeah.
It's buried. I think that we will remember the 20th century, or human beings will remember the 20th century, not as the century in which socialism died, but where it was first given birth, where it first experimentally tried. We have a situation now where, since the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Yes.
in this period of so-called end of history,
Yeah.
you see what unfettered capitalism really means for the people of the world. Here you have 3 billion people living on less than $2 a day, and you have 450 people who are billionaires who have the equivalent wealth of those 3 billion poorest people. So
Is it that dramatic?
it's that dramatic.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if you wonder why are there so many poor people and hungry people and starving people, it's because the other people, it's a very, very tiny group of capitalists, have all the money.
Yeah.
And they have acquired the money not because they've earned it, not because they're smarter, but because they control
Capital.
They control capital, and they control thus the ability to harness the wealth created by working people around the world. They don't create the wealth. Workers, when they go to work, create value. They create products. The products are necessary for society. But a handful of robber barons, because of their legal entitlement to this property, because it's capitalist private property, are able to accumulate huge wealth. And all they care about is that wealth and the perseverance of that wealth. So they will tell us that this is the end of history. And I would say this, that when you look at India, for instance, I have a friend who's at the World Social Forum.
Yeah,
in the
she's
last
going
week.
now, yeah.
She's there now. She told me that outside Mumbai, outside the convention center, families, many thousands of families are looking for a piece of dirt on which to sleep. There's no blanket, no plastic covering, no tent, nothing at all. They have nothing.
Yeah.
If you took any kind of similar condition and said that that condition existed in a socialist country, the conclusion would be, see, that shows that socialism is a failure. But nobody is saying, well, capitalism in India or capitalism around the world that leaves 3 billion people on the planet living on less than $2 a day is a humane system or a dynamic system. The inherent contradiction that Marx talked about.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
It's a very simple thing.
Yeah.
It's called the crisis of overproduction.
Yeah.
Capitalism, through its competition, through its dynamic competition between varying capitals to reach a market, produces
it turns out a lot of stuff.
Produces dynamically, but it also produces without a plan, and consequently, eventually, more is produced than can be sold at a profit. And instead of workers realizing the value of what they had or enjoying it, they are laid off, not because they have produced too little, but because they've produced too much. You see auto workers and miners and rubber workers and agricultural workers losing their jobs or losing their farms, not because there's too little rubber, steel, iron, auto, or farm produce, but because there's too much that can be sold at a market. It's like the miner's riddle, the old mine worker's riddle. There's the family's in a cold hut in a cold house in Western Virginia. The miner's daughter says to him, "Daddy, why is it so cold in here?" and he says, "Well, it's cold because we don't have any coal." She said, "Well, why don't we have coal?" And he says, "Well, we don't have coal because we don't have money." She said, "Well, why don't you have money?" He said, "Well, because I was laid off." "Why were you laid off?" "Because we produced too much coal." In other words, the coal miner,
that's a metaphor,
unable to feed their family, not because too little has been produced, but too much has been produced to profit the capitalists. That's the inherent contradiction Marx talked about. The contradiction.
That could lead to deflationary.
Well, it leads to
deflationary depression. I think that, you got an overproductive capability. Could it be read that way? That we have ability to produce goods and services, socially enhancing goods and services, ecologically enhancing goods and services, but that the folks do not have the ability to buy that which is capable of being produced. Is that a way of seeing it also, or
it's
not?
It's partly that. It's partly people don't have the money to buy back that which they produce. In other words, the problem of underconsumption. But what we really have
$2 a day, you can't buy a heck of a lot.
That's true. But what we really have is an absurd system.
Yeah.
There's no such
seems that way to me too.
There's no such thing as too much food. There's no such thing as too many clothes. There's no such thing as producing too much of the necessities that people need for life. It only becomes too much when the capitalist can't make a profit off the production and sale of it. So we need to free the productive apparatus, that which produces great things, and let it be free from the ups and downs of recession and depression, the problem of overproduction. And then production can be set in motion not to produce a profit for the capitalist, but to meet human needs. That way you overcome recession, you overcome depression, and you overcome the problem where tens of millions of people who would like to work can't work because no capitalist will hire them. And they won't hire them because they can't sell the products. So Marx talked about the crisis of overproduction in capitalism, an unknown phenomena in any other social system. It can only be rationalized when we take all the technology, all the wherewithal, all the means of production that exist to satisfy human need, and free those things from the private ownership of the ultra-rich, the billionaires, and use it instead to meet human needs.
Suppose you had a democratic, suppose you had, let's just fantasize or think ahead or something. I had granddaughters now. Amazing how it makes you think generation and that sort of thing. Suppose you had a situation where rather than the plutocratic, and it's becoming more concentrated, the ownership of the capital assets is becoming more and more concentrated through time on a global scale and nationally and so forth. But suppose you had, is there any way to think in terms of how there would be, instead of a plutocratic capitalism, there would be widespread ownership of the non-labor aspects of production, the capital assets, which could be part of a way of distributing income other than just through a rationale by way people, the masses, get their income by their labor contribution to production. Is it possible to have a democratic capitalism?
I don't think so.
You do not think so, and
no.
why?
I think private property means that the certain group of those who already have money, who have capital, are able to acquire the private property and either then destroy their competitors or be destroyed in the process of capitalist competition, as happens, and that's where the merger phenomena goes through. And the media, look how the media is getting all concentrated now.
It's very concentrated.
We have,
and becoming more so,
the tendency for capitalism to leave its competitive stage and become monopoly capitalism or mega capitalism is a lawful process that exists all around the world. The only way to make capitalism democratic is to take the capital and give it to the people. Give it to the people and let the people democratically decide what's to be built, what should be produced, how to satisfy human want. In other words, make the criteria be human need rather than the next quarter's bottom line for the investors, because each board of directors, each CEO of any corporation, they make decisions just to satisfy investors who are investing to maximize profit. I'll give you an example. In 1995, IBM made $5 billion. It was a record year for IBM. At the end of the year, the board of directors decided to lay off 40 or 50,000 workers. That wiped out huge parts of upstate New York, just north of New York City.
They're just going to send 120,000 across the sea now. It just announced the Wall Street Journal yesterday.
So who
outsourcing, they call it.
So who made the decision? Well, the workers who produced the $5 billion in wealth for IBM, they didn't make the decision. The board of directors made the decision. The democracy belonged to the board of directors. That's capitalist democracy. They had the right to decide. So those people who actually went to work every day, worked hard, produced a great profit for IBM, were then replaced by new computers, new machines, and they said, thank you very much, you're laid off, and IBM went on. Now,
that's going on. That's going on relentlessly.
A rational democratic system says, why should a board of directors, who have contributed so little, probably nothing, to the actual profit of IBM's
very concentrated decision-making capability, they would say.
And that's
hard won in the business school at Harvard.
And that's the tendency in capitalism in general, and we see that manifested in the executive branch of the government right now. You see Congress itself is becoming more and more, and has for quite a while, just a talk shop. Power is concentrated in the executive. The executive, the centralized power representing the centralized power of monopoly capitalism.
Empire.
It has an empire in terms of global, in
yeah.
terms of its global dimension, but at home, it means shred the Bill of Rights, have a Patriot Act, give the executive branch
Patriot Act 2.
and coming soon, the Patriot Act 2.
Yeah.
But that gives the executive branch the right to decide who's an enemy combatant,
Yeah.
who gets to see a lawyer, who gets to meet their accuser, who gets to see or even hear about evidence. Before there was secret evidence, now there's no evidence, just George Bush.
Yeah.
So we see in capitalist society an organic tendency towards monopoly centralization, both at the corporate level and in the government level, and that naturally leads to their desire to concentrate power globally. That's why we have the Pentagon. You see, we, the taxpayers, are spending $400 billion a year, and soon it'll be $700 billion a year.
It's going to go up that much. Huh?
Yeah, within 3 years.
That's within the allotted pattern now that's been...
Yes, by 2007, up to a $500 billion a year.
What is that? Do you happen to know what percentage of GDP that is? It's not so staggering when you see it that way.
It's a small
historical pattern. Yeah.
But also the military-industrial complex isn't simply the military budget. You have to look at the ripple effect of that economy. How many of the scientists and engineers and chemists and technicians who would be available to be employed to produce things that people could actually use are instead being used to produce things that can only destroy people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
and they end up with atomic and hydrogen weaponry and so forth.
Yeah, we're getting the next generation of tactical nuclear weapons, which according to Bush's new military strategic security doctrine of 2002, are to be employed in actual battles against even non-nuclear powers. This whole tendency of capitalism is not only to centralize power, it is, I think, in an organic direction, going in the a full-blown militarism, without which capitalism really can't survive. You see, if you're spending
full spectrum dominance.
Full spectrum dominance is a military strategy.
Bunker buster tactical nuclear weapons are being developed. It's pretty staggering.
It's staggering, and it shows the bankruptcy of an economic and social system. If the only way you can prop up an economy is to centralize power in the hands of fewer and fewer rich people, and then have a state subsidize those corporations not to produce things people need, but to produce things that kill people, and then have 127 countries have U.S. military installations. That's what it is now.
Yeah. Well,
and there are
how many?
127 countries
have U.S. military. Talk about Roman expansion of their power into Dacia. Yeah.
Well, the Roman Empire compares to the U.S. Empire only by its diminutive size.
Oh, I see, yeah.
But you have, I think, a tendency that's 120, that's right. So and you see the war in Afghanistan. What's going on there? The U.S. is setting up military bases in Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all the areas that were the former southern republics of the USSR, the former Soviet Union, where there also is a concentration of natural gas and petroleum products like oil.
Imagine that.
Surprising, I know.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So American taxpayers are being told there's no money right now for expanded education. Tuitions are going up in the public schools. There's no money for full health care for the 45 million Americans who don't have health care.
Isn't that staggering? For an industrial, well-developed, leading country, and you got 45 million people that can crawl to the steps of the hospital and be told, be gone.
That's right.
It's a staggering reality. It's like Dickensian or something.
But that money exists to finance every human being in America and the United States to have a full, free health care. But instead, the priorities of the government, which are the priorities of the capitalist economic establishment, are to sustain this world empire with this military tentacles everywhere. So if you're going to finance 127 military bases in 127 countries, 700 installations altogether, well, that's a lot of money, and it has to come from somewhere, and it's not a big problem for George Bush or any of the other politicians to say, well, let it come from working class and poor communities in the United States, because they don't count.
Yeah, well, and they had to give, and there's very little precious left over for discretionary anything. Like, we had the same problem with Vietnam. Remember, they had I think that Johnson got a lot done. War on poverty Head Start, a lot of things were being done in that, but that damn Vietnam War really did eat into it. But now they've got a thing where there's very little discretionary income over for plans or something like that, because they gave this huge tax cut to the already wealthy people in the name of some political or economic philosophy that's a little hard for a lot of people to understand, whether it's Mundell's supply side or Friedman or whatever. But they've given that tax cut, and there's very little left over for there to be needs of education and the needs of the folks that might. And there are some people on that side of things who have this idea, what is it called, starve the beast or something, and the beast being any kind of government interference in terms of unregulated, full-fledged, full-spectrum domination by market fundamentalism as an ideology just getting to be in the saddle. Do you think? Or
well, I think the Bush administration
set me straight on some
the
of
Bush administration plays a game. It says, well, we're against big government because that's the rhetoric of the conservatives.
They're expanding tremendously, the spending.
They're expanding the government a lot, but it's the government, the part of the government that doesn't meet human needs. It's the part of the government, say, that's going to make sure that they can read every keystroke that you use on your computer, or the expansion through Homeland Security and the Patriot Act of the agencies for domestic repression. You see in Bush's State of the Union message, he didn't back away from the Patriot Act. He embraced it right up front as one of the top priorities of the government.
Yeah.
Well, what we are witnessing is the cynical use of what happened on September 11th by a government that had a preordained foreign and domestic policy well before September 11th, but using that as a pretext. And you take Iraq, for instance. This comes to the question of big government and money. The United States spends $1 billion and probably $2 billion every week in Iraq to occupy that country. They're clearly not being accepted as liberators by the Iraqi people. That's a lie.
Okay, you want to make that, okay, go on.
There were no weapons of mass destruction there. There's no connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, and yet the United States went to war. Now, they can spend $2 billion a week. That's where that's $87 billion, and before that, $79 billion to pay for the war occupation.
On top of all the sanctions that were delivered down upon Iraq for 12 years and so forth.
For the Iraqi people, the sanctions killed 1.5 million people.
Is that documentable? That's not just some sort of a thing blowing from the people who are opposed to the system in place. It's documentable by the UN figures.
These are based on
1.5 million
over the 13-year period in which economic sanctions. And
a great number of those are little children?
Well, who dies because they don't have food and medicine? It's usually the most vulnerable sectors of society. Children, 5,000 each month, who were dying, who were not dying before the 1991 sanctions. The other 3,000 were mainly their grandparents, older people who are also vulnerable.
The old, the weak, the vulnerable, weak and young.
Madeleine Albright, when she was the U.S.
60 Minutes,
the U.S. Secretary to the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, admitted when asked by Leslie Stahl, well, you've killed 500,000 babies in Iraq, is the price worth it? And she said, well, that's a tough question, but yes, the price is worth it. That's an admission of guilt really by the U.S. government that somehow it's okay to kill 500,000 Iraqi babies.
Well, why don't we talk to that thing about what it is that's so valuable that was it worth it? Because the neocon, I mean, Mr. Wolfowitz and Pearl and that sort of thing, they had that going from the 1970s, that view. Mr. Wolfowitz had his eye on Iraq since the 1970s. It wasn't as though it just happened on 9/11 or something. It was could be perceived as a pretense for going through, but there's a strategic thinking behind that. There's a strategic thinking behind that idea that the model that we have, which is to be brought to the whole world, is being thwarted by some backward people who refuse to accept the wisdom of the model that we're ready to bring to the world. And one source of that opposition was Iraq led by Saddam Hussein, and he's got this thing of consistently supporting the Palestinians and the question of what's going on in the West Bank and Israel and so forth, so that there was a targeting of that from way back, was there not? I mean, it seems to me.
Well, I don't know who said it, but you know the expression, there are permanent interests but no permanent allies. The permanent interests of the United States are to dominate that region and to dominate its oil resources. At one time, the Saddam Hussein government in the 1980s was an ally, or treated as an ally. The U.S. government egged the Saddam Hussein government on for its invasion in Iran in order to weaken the Iranian Revolution And also, as Henry Kissinger said in his memoirs, we were hoping that both sides would kill each other.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
In other words, a cynical...
Well, they did. How many were killed? It was 1 million or something killed in
And
the
U.S. turned out to have given arms and money and intelligence to Iraq, but also during the Iran-Contra scandal, we learned that they gave the money to the Iranians as well.
Sometime they were smuggling cocaine in from Central America.
So the question is...
Barbara Trent's thing,
yeah. The question that you asked is this targeting part of a neoconservative strategy?
Or in the neoconservative thing, part of a larger strategy.
Right.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
I would say that the neoconservative strategy has been to aggressively topple the government in Iraq and replace it with a proxy government. But it's very important for people in the United States to remember that the policy for regime change in Iraq did not originate with the neoconservatives, and it did not originate with the Republicans. It originated with the Clinton administration in December 1998 when the Clinton government pulled the weapons inspectors out and began the massive bombing of Iraq between December 16th and December 19th, 1998. They dropped 1,000 bombs and missiles on Iraq. They said Iraq was not cooperating. And then they passed something called the Iraq Liberation Act, and that was passed by almost all members of Congress and almost all senators. It was almost unanimous, in other words. And it began the process of aiding and sending huge tens of millions of dollars worth of arms and equipment and training to those who are now the new government in Iraq. In other words, their proxy forces. And that decision was adopted by liberal and conservative alike inside the U.S. Congress. Dennis Kucinich voted for that, I believe. In other words, this wasn't just a neoconservative strategy. This was the U.S. military, economic, political establishment said, Iraq existed as an independent or nominally independent country, controlling its own vast oil resources, the second largest oil resources in the world. We're going to put an end to that, and we're going to take the country back. And when they did that, all the politicians on the left and on the right pretty much lined up with the powers that be on that. Very little opposition. And what we saw, I think, after September 11th was the neoconservatives who had taken the White House in the 2001 election, not legally, of course, and only through racist disenfranchisement. They took advantage of September 11th to fully and aggressively execute a policy that had strong backing throughout the ruling class in the United States, which was to get rid of the Iraqi government and replace it with a semi-colonial or puppet-type regime.
You think that's the way it is? So it seems to me what was it, something for New Priorities or some sort of a group that was together back in the 70s even. And Wolfowitz was there in the 70s. Pearls was there in the 70s. And they were arguing for a basic new conservative agenda, which is now very influential, to put it mildly, on international affairs or in the halls of Congress and in the government that's in place and so forth. And what it is a kind of thing. What is it at base? If we start talking economic, political economy or something like that, is it at base? Is it? Or let me back up a little bit, back to the question you started talking about, Karl Marx and so forth, socialism, that sort of thing. What economic theory will be informing that, do you think, or who is the writer or the school of economic theory that will inform that neoconservative group or the ruling Republican Party? Is it, we had Karl Marx, we had Adam Smith, we had Marshall, we had Karl Marx, we had Schumpeter, we had Van Hayek, we have Keynes, we have Friedman. Who is it, what is the economic theory that is informing the political leadership about the way and the assumptions under which this great planet Earth and this great spaceship Earth, as Bucky Fuller would have called it, is being addressed in terms of policy decisions? What's the economic theory guiding this planet of ours, do you think, by its world leadership? That would include the assumption under the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organization, and so forth. What do you think is the basic economic theory that's directing that?
I don't think it's one theory.
Okay.
I think there are contending theories, but they all have this in common. They all believe that the world's resources should be plundered and looted for the benefit of U.S. corporations, who then, as an apology, as a form of propaganda, say, well, this will really be good for the people who have been looted and plundered. So Bolivia, denationalize all of your industry, privatize it, let the United States government come in and take it over. And the reason you would do that is that your debt to the IMF and to the World Bank will be rolled over.
Structural adjustment.
Structural adjustment. And the world...
Or it's been done in the name
Bolivia
of that.
did that. The Bolivian governments did that.
Look what happened to Argentina.
In Argentina. And the people ultimately have to rebel, and they have rebelled, and they will continue to rebel.
Okay.
So the theories of capitalist economics are largely apologetics for a strategy of extraction of wealth from those who have it and the concentration of wealth of those who already, those who possess natural wealth, and the concentration of that wealth in the vaults, in the banks in New York City, or in Paris, or in Bonn. What's happening with structural adjustment, whether there's liberal or conservative economic theory, is that the third world, the underdeveloped world, the formerly colonized world, is being told...
Formerly and still, neocolonialism is very much in effect.
Well, I believe this is the consequence of the destruction of the Soviet Union and the socialist camp, is those countries in the past, before 1991, if the U.S. attempted to sanction them or destroy them, which it frequently did, they at least had an alternative economic system that they could get aid or trade or have some economic intercourse with.
Bipolar world, right?
And now the formerly colonized, the emerging world has been left with no options. If you want access to credit, which you need in order to have access to technology, which you need in order to develop, then you have to play the game of the IMF and the World Bank. And the game is not really a funny game at all.
It's a rigged game.
It's a rigged game. It's a game where one side puts a gun to the other person's head and says, empty your wallet, empty your pockets, give us your what's in your ground and in your natural resources, give us the labor of your workers, get rid of labor rights, get rid of environmental protections that...
Structurally adjust,
that is capitalist globalization. That's what globalization really means. So whether you call it the Friedman School or Jeffrey Sachs or whoever.
I'm not sure. That's what I was trying to get at, how you put them up. Because February 15th, you had a hand in that. You've had a hand with the Answer Coalition and getting some people, the folks out in demonstrations and so forth. You've been involved in that. We had this great demonstration on February 15th, and the New York Times famously said we have two great superpowers, the United States of America and world public opinion. And you're saying that you got half the population of the world is on $2 a day. It's getting, some people, even Stiglitz and others will say, outside of, in a establishment kind of position, will say that the system that's in place, the system that the globalizing system in place, is not serving the interest of 60 to 70% of the world population, and the conditions are getting worse. Now, Mr. Bush has said everything's going well, everything's growing, some will trickle down, some will get to the people. We're progressing, things are getting better, we're making discoveries, they'll say that sort of thing, but it's getting worse. And that you have, do you think there's anything in the soul or in the heart or in the mind of the system, the capitalist system that's in place, might be worried about the possibility, because on the whole, there's no thought as to what the people think. It's never really mattered. I don't think it mattered much to Louis XVI or the feudal courts of Europe in the in the 70s. What the people thought, it didn't matter very much. But do you think there's ever a stirring anywhere that this thing where you've got world public opinion and there's opposition to the system as a system is worrying to the leadership, the intellectual or political leadership of the world model? Because there's something there blowing in the wind on the world scale. You got that thing in Bolivia just happened, Argentina, Chavez, you got things going in other parts of the world, Africa, that they're worried at a systems level that a massive threat could be looming for the traditional leadership pattern that's being very well served by the traditional pattern in place, the plutocratic pattern in each of the countries, that there's a large-scale challenge to that's coming that will be based among the masses of the world, and that they're really, really concerned about, and that's why they're gearing up in this paranoid full spectra dominance thing in order to set them into place just the way the feudal lords would want to set the serfs in their place back in the 16th century or something.
Yes, I think
a big change coming. What I'm saying, that maybe we haven't been able to see it even.
I think so. I think you're onto something there. I think the ruling class of any society always fears rebellion. They don't talk about it. They show great confidence. They show this is the end of history. Each empire says we're the crowning achievement of the human race. But just as the priests and princes in Germany in 1525 at the time of the Reformation, they were severely aware that the peasants could rise up as they did and kill thousands of priests who were their oppressors and the feudal lords, and they wanted the kingdom of God now, which in their minds meant communalizing the plantations on which they were bonded.
Just see what the Goths did in Dacia.
Yeah.
In the Roman days.
And what we saw, I think, with the anti-war movement in the last 2 years, the Answer Coalition, which you mentioned, which I'm
we got to
one of
get
the
to it.
organizers.
Yeah.
That anti-war movement was a shocking development. Within a few days after September 11th, when Bush seemed to be like tall in the saddle and commanding everyone, and everyone was bowing before Bush after the terrible attack on September 11th, we formed a coalition called Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. In other words, a broad coalition of organizations who are part of the anti-globalization movement, fighting against the impact of capitalist globalization on working people here and abroad.
Haven't you been encouraging people to demonstrate on occasion or two against the system in place?
That's what I'm saying, is that we immediately started demonstrating.
I'm just kidding.
I know you are.
Yeah.
We immediately started demonstrating.
Yeah, right. From the get-go, right.
And on September 29th, 18 days after September 11th, we had a demonstration against Bush's war drive, which we knew was coming, of 25,000 people. And that was hard to do that under those circumstances.
Yeah.
Since then, and especially as the Bush administration began to prepare for war against Iraq, the Answer Coalition initiated a demonstration on October 26th where 200,000 came to Washington.
Really, that many?
And then on January...
That's not your inflated figures, that's real?
Those are our numbers, but those numbers are well recognized by people. I mean, it was the biggest demonstration of anything like it since the Vietnam War. A month later, 2 months later, on January 18th, we had 500,000 in Washington, D.C., and then on February 15th, many coalitions came together in New York City. There was demonstrations of 500,000. And then as we went, almost every month, hundreds of thousands in the States and millions globally at the same time, coordinated, working together, were demonstrating against war. And it was our contention that we were fighting against the war not simply because war is the absence of peace, but war, as von Clausewitz said, is the extension of politics by other means. And the politics of today are the politics of that split in the world between the 3 billion poorest people, the poor, the peasants, the workers in the third world, as well as working people in the United States, and a handful of billionaires and the corporations they control in the West. And the war was a war for rich people. Poor people go and kill other poor people.
Always has been, hasn't it?
Yes,
hasn't it always been? History is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken, in James Joyce.
Yes.
What a history. The serfs have been led around like sheep and...
until they rebel. Until
they rebel. Spartacus tried.
What I think what we were witnessing, and we are witnessing, and I think this is the hopeful part of the time that we live in, is the irony is George Bush stole the election in 2001, even though the electorate had really moved to the left slightly when you put together the Gore and Nader vote. Bush, the most right-wing president, came into office. His policies created a global left-wing progressive movement, the revitalization of the movement, which not only is against war, but identifies with the struggle of working people everywhere. And that movement, I think, represents the hopeful part of what's going on in world politics. And our purpose, the purpose of the Answer Coalition, or the International Action Center...
Or the anti-system that be movement worldwide that is blowing in the wind.
Exactly.
That's what I was getting at.
That's what I'm saying, is that
it may not be
it's not just rhetoric.
You go ahead.
It's not rhetoric, because you can look at the last 2 years and see that a new global movement has emerged. And we'll be out in the streets again on March 20th.
You're going to be, Answer's going to be out on the streets again.
And many coalitions. There will be not only demonstration against occupation of Iraq and bring the troops home from Iraq, not tomorrow, but immediately. We're going to be standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people who are living under occupation, and the U.S., gives Israel $15 million a day to carry out a war against Palestinian rights there.
Yeah, that's a big issue, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, you can't...
That wall's being built now.
The wall is being...
And the security of that area. I saw a thing at Davos where they had a thing and they had all the big leadership and everything, and they asked a question about Middle East, and they said, what's the most important issue? Iraq was looming and all that sort of thing, and all these leaders of business and think tanks and that, and they said, what's the major problem as far as that part of the region? It's Palestine. That's the problem,
Well, the Palestinian people's resistance...
And we seem to just be supporting Mr. Sharon and whatever, and there's upset on the part of the Israeli people who feel maybe besieged by an irrational force that's coming at them from Islamicists and so forth. And is that a metaphor for their advanced culture in a certain sense in terms of technology and development, and the advanced cultures of the world, which which the United States is the leader in a certain sense, might feel besieged by a larger mass of the population, and then that would get down in a class sense between what would be called the workers or the plutocrats. But there's a dialectic shaping up here that might be really creating some really interesting fireworks in the not-too-distant future, is what I'm getting at.
Sure,
The weak of the world maybe are finding a kind of ability to bring pressure, effective pressure, against those who have and do control things in a...
Well, you asked the question, Harold, before, do the rulers ever listen?
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is they only offer concessions to the people when they feel that if they don't offer concessions to the people, that the people will overthrow them. In other words, that the rebellion and protest will lead to revolution.
Right.
And what we're not...
And it has, hasn't it, in a dialectic?
Well,
I mean,
I think
Hegel was onto something, and so was Marx, I think.
I mean, revolution is inevitable. I mean, there's no question. Wherever society has been divided between have and have-nots, ultimately the have-nots, taking on an arduous path and a difficult path and against great repression normally, find a way to get themselves together and struggle for justice. Now, that's a continuum of the human evolution. That history hasn't ended and won't end until we have a society where it's not cruelly divided between a few haves and the multitude of people who are have-nots. That's what's happening in the world. Some Americans are shielded, not Americans, people living in the United States.
Bourgeois,
they're shielded by the stark impoverishment and polarization that's going on.
They're shielded from realizing that.
But there are, there are tens of millions of people in the United States who experience that every day of their lives.
And it's growing all the time, I think.
Sure. I mean,
in
New York and in rural areas, in the cities and in the towns, you see a polarization between rich and poor and between workers and their employers or bosses. And this idea that socialism is dead, that socialism won't revive, I think is nonsense. Socialism will revive. The lessons learned from failed or mistaken policies in different parts of the world will be assimilated by those who are fighting for justice. That's a growing process. It took 400 years for capitalism to take power, and I really believe that socialism, as a consequence of people's rebellion and revolution, is not only likely but inevitable, because that will be the only way to bring some rationality to society. And also, if you look at the degradation of the environment by capitalist economy, this will go on until it's stopped. And the condition of the planet, the very survival of the planet and the people who live here, is threatened by the kind of capitalist development which does not ever care about environmental concerns or workers' concerns, only cares about what's good for investors, what's good for maximizing profit.
And the investor class is very small and getting more concentrated, that sort of thing, the inherent contradiction. I wonder, one of the things we have a lot to talk about. We're talking a large tableau. A couple of things I'd like to try and bring up if I could. You should talk about robber barons. I looked up in Burke's Peerage. Did you ever look in Burke's Peerage?
I have not.
You should go visit Burke's Peerage, because Burke's Peerage, the barons were relatively low on this scale. I mean, it was the dukes and the earls that really were the big shots in terms of the feudalistic order and so forth. We had a feudalistic order that dictated the evolution of culture in the Western, and then there came this revolution in the United States of America a couple hundred years ago, about 1776, and we had this revolution, and that came to inform Les Miserables of France and the movement toward, Republican and modern democratic, modern notions of what we call democracy and so forth. Do you think the system that's in place now, the system that so much thinks that it has legitimacy to where it can have the ability to, and then they call there terrorists, anyone who is in opposition to that, Louis XVI or King George of England called George Washington a terrorist.
Well, Dick Cheney called Nelson Mandela a terrorist, and did right up until 1988, 2 years before Mandela got out of prison. But
what I'm saying is that was an idea that, and it was hard. It was having a hard time keeping itself going, even in the United States. There was a lot of Tories that were against the American Revolution here. It was informed by the Scottish Enlightenment, I think, to a large degree, that American Revolution. But do you think that, so at 500 years of feudalism, we had a couple hundred years of this system, the Republican representative democracy politically, economic plutocracy as a given and that sort of thing. But it's reached a certain point, and there's something new on a large scale, the way the American example challenged the feudal order, that is now challenging the whole system based upon some qualitative transformation that's taking place, maybe, again, back to Bobby Dylan, blowing in the wind and not seen in the normal everyday politics. And if it is, I wonder, we talk here in the United States about how we're going to outsource people, labor, and you talk about Marx's surplus labor theory of value, but what do we do in a world where the input, for good or ill, somebody owns the technology, it's increasingly technology that is responsible for production as opposed to labor. And if we're going to only have, as a system of distributing income to the masses of the people, their labor responsibility, I mean, it's not only just outsourcing to other countries that is happening, but there is, and Lord Keynes said for these very times in that letter to his grandchildren, he wrote in 1930, he said, we are going to be facing technological unemployment on a large scale, and we now have software programs that are going to be able to replace huge numbers of certified public accountants, investment banker, decision makers, all kinds of things are going to be able to be displaced by our technological extensions of our consciousness, and that we're coming into a situation, I'll run this up, Bucky Fuller said we're transcending the iron law because it's very productive capability in the abstract, that we're actually transcending scarcity as an ontologic reality, and we're coming out of history, 200,000 years of history, and we've come to a situation where we have the ability to make this planet work for everybody within an ecological context that we simply didn't have out of history, that we're transcending the condition out of which this society was born. Do you think there's anything to try to see things in that comprehensive condition? And if there's technological displacement of labor, how are we going to relate the people to the productive capability and also have the ability for the market to be there to clear the market, as it were, in a capitalist way of thinking, if that is the case, and this against a backdrop that we now have technologically extended capability in weaponry that, if it happens to be unleashed in the guns of August way, now means, for the first time in human history, the end of our species if they unleash the weaponry that's there. Could you talk to some of those things and the potential role of socialism, as you see it, as a model that is relevant to that new order, or if not, what is needed in terms of leadership of understanding of this broadly conceived evolution of universal consciousness and the human scenario?
Well, Karl Marx, in his prognosis, considered that socialism would be the next stage after capitalism. In other words, not the elimination or negation of capitalism, but the taking of what capitalism had produced and making it rational, because instead of it being privately owned for personal profit of already rich people, it could be collectively owned and used to meet human need. In other words, that was the prognosis of Marx. It turned out to be different. The revolutions, the socialist revolutions, happened where capitalism was least developed, where it was poorest, where the conditions for building socialism were most difficult.
But the principle of distribution was need, but not ownership or of contribution to production is what I'm getting at.
I understand.
And that pattern of need seems to be the people who control it, either government or business. They always decide that the folks only need one little half a bowl of gruel.
Well,
you understand what I'm saying?
I definitely understand what you're saying. Let me just to finish the thought, though, is that the conditions for liberation of the human race from scarcity, to eliminate want, to make sure people have as much food and as many clothes and as much shelter as they need to live a decent life, and to have education.
Everybody.
And to have labor. And to have labor be transformed from a need to a want. In other words, you work because you want to work. That's possible once you take this vast scientific, technological apparatus that we see expanding day in and day out. We see it in the last 10 years.
It's been pretty productive. It's had a hell of a run.
But the problem is,
created a lot of milk.
The problem is, Harold, under the capitalist system, when IBM makes that $5 billion in 1995, it turns around and lays off workers and says you are redundant surplus workers.
It may be the technology is going to be displacing the workers in the production process. You can have robots running things. You got easy pass for toll taking instead of people collecting bills. There's a technological displacement of labor in the productive process, but it's overwhelmingly productive is what I'm saying.
But just to finish my point.
Yeah, sorry. No.
There's nothing wrong with the displacement of labor by technology if labor is not plunged into poverty as a consequence.
So how are they going to get money if they don't have a job?
What we need to do is be able to look at technology as a force of liberation if it's liberated, if the technology is liberated from private ownership. In other words,
go on.
In other words, if the productive process is not set in motion just to make profit for the capitalist but to meet human need, if technology replaces human labor, then working people guaranteed a right to a job and a guaranteed a right to education and housing and health care, and the fruits of the wealth of society would not need to work so long, not need to work so hard, have more leisure time, more time for education.
Okay, but the leisure time, and as soon as you start saying that, the leisure time is not, the workers are going to be displaced by the technology. I mean, it's beyond outsourcing. They're going to be able, you've got a tremendous productive capability of robotic systems, that can produce it. And you just said if they're going to have the right to a job, they're going to have the right to some stream of income so that they're not going to be poverty struck when the technology takes over what has been labor's contribution, because labor's contribution in real terms. Now, I don't know how we deal with the historical injustices and how we deal with that and everything like that, but it's going to take over the labor's traditional contribution to production is being superseded.
Well, I don't mean I don't know if we're getting too arcane, but I just say this: if you're using technology in order to liberate society from want, then you can provide people with the things that they need, not as a consequence of having to be a wage worker, but in order to have a just allocation and distribution of products.
Right.
Now, we're talking about a society...
You can do that through the government, on the basis of need.
Through a collectivized ownership of the technology, whether it's...
Now, how about collectivized private ownership? That they have if it's good for Duke capitalist A to have 100,000 shares of a technology company producing thing, what if is it all right for there to be distribution of income to the masses of the people instead of pulling the wool over their eyes with the idea about their labor input to it, because they can be freed from that. You're going to be able to be freed from it. You're going to have an alternative system for distributing income. Now, if it's all going to be left in the hands of the government, you're going to do away with the private sector. That's a problem. I mean, you distribute according to the need, and even government bureaucrats get to where they only...
Nobody has...
Why can't you distribute ownership of capital assets, private capital assets, as an instrument of income distribution, massively democratize that as a way of distributing income, and also allow for a wider and broader capital formation capability for us to do what we're technologically capable of doing, but we don't have a system that allows us to do what we're capable of doing. Why does it have to be the elimination of private property? Well, is the question.
I don't mean the elimination.
We have.
I don't mean the elimination of personal property. There can be an expansion of personal property by taking the instruments that produce all the wealth in society and take it away from individuals like the Fords and the Rockefellers and the DuPonts, and give it to the people, let the people run it, and let people have a real democratic decision-making power.
Got to say goodbye. Okay, we just got started. We have to do some more programming along some of these lines somewhat. Your pleasure. Brian Becker, you're doing great work. You're going to do, you put contact information up for International Action Center and the Answer Coalition. Sorry, we got off on a couple of things. There's too many things to talk about. And your pleasure to have his perception. We invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for now. Brian, thanks a lot for coming in. Oh, God. Anyway, that was good. This is an amazing time to be alive and participant.
Oh, yeah.